My presentation will be mainly based on the results of the survey of post-80s in Shanghai, and the survey was organized by Professor Peng Xizhe at Fudan University. And the baseline survey actually was done in 2013, about 2 years ago, and covered nearly 3,000 Shanghai youth. So this post-80s generation, they are right in the process of transition to adulthood, and also they are the first generation of the single child in China. And here I would more focus on their childbearing behavior, okay? So let's put this issue in a global framework. Actually, in the past half a century, fertility decline is one of the prominent demographic changes in the world, and fertility has been on the decline for almost all the part of the world, and China here has also achieved very great progresses in reducing its birth rate. So here we can see back in 1950s and 60s, we had a total fertility rate at around 6 or 7 children per woman, but right now our fertility in China is about 1.5 kids per woman. And what about a case in Shanghai? 50 years ago or 40 years ago, actually, back in 1975, we can see here Shanghai had already achieved a low fertility of 1.37 children per couple. So this was about the similar current level of fertility in Japan. And nowadays, Shanghai has already achieved well below 1 child per couple fertility. So we are curious about the current fertility patterns among this young group in Shanghai. This is the age pattern of fertility for Shanghai female youth. And we could see that the share of those who have had children rose quickly over age, from less than 10% at the age of 24 to over 80% by the age of 32. So that means among the 32-year-old women in Shanghai, actually only less than 20% of them have not had kids yet. So this proportion is much lower than our neighboring countries like Singapore, like Japan, and also lower than in the US and in Europe. So even like Shanghai, we have very low fertility. We are among the lowest low fertility regions in the world, but the young females are still relatively traditional. They are still have an earlier age at childbearing. And this is the pattern for males. Even though we can see here the proportion of having had children for males is much lower than for their female counterparts at each age, but again, there is a jump at the age of 32. By the age of 32, we can see over 50% of the males have already had their kids. So actually, the next issue is whether this age pattern of fertility differs by educational groups. So in order to answer this question, we divide our sample into 2 groups. One group is those with a college education, as shown in this green curve. Those have the bachelor's, master's, or even PhDs. And the red curve represents those without college education. Here, this is for females. We see that in early ages, at the age of 20s, the proportion of having had children is much less for college-educated women than for those without college education. But there is a very obvious catch-up behavior in early 30s. So by the age of 32 years old, actually the proportion of having had children is exactly the same for these 2 groups. So this indicates that the well-educated groups, the well-educated women, they are postponing their childbirth, but that does not mean that they are not having children at all. So the pattern for males actually is different for females. From this part, we can see that the men with the college education are much less likely to have kids than the peers without college education at all ages, at least by age of 20. By the age of 32 years old or 33 years old, we have not observed any catch-up behavior. But maybe this catch-up behavior will occur at later ages, say at late 30s or even early 40s. And in China, when we are talking about birth rate, we cannot avert the issue of imbalanced sex ratio at birth. the sex ratio at birth is the ratio of like the male live births to the female live births times 100. So China, now we have an imbalanced gender structure, while the son preference is one of the important reasons for the imbalanced gender structures. And in our sample, we can see the sex ratio at birth for the first parity is 107, and this is within the normal range of 103 to 107. Then for the urban couples, for the youth with the urban hukou, the sex ratio at birth for their first child is 1, okay? But for agricultural hukou youth, the ratio is as high as 117, so much higher than the upper limit of the normal range. Then for the second parity, for the second child, okay, for the urban hukou youth, the ratio is still normal, but for agricultural hukou population, the figure is actually incredible. So reaches about 2, that means in the second child born by these like agricultural hukou youth, the number of male babies born is about twice the number of female babies born. So this will exacerbate the future problem of surplus men in China. So some preference is still persisting in the countryside, even for those who are living in Shanghai. And for fertility change, one of the important reasons for fertility change is the changes in fertility intention. So intention measures your preference. In the questionnaire, we ask these young population, if there were no family planning policy, how many children do you prefer? What is your ideal family size? Okay. And here we can see about 40% of them prefer to have only one child, and about 56% prefer to have 2 kids. And the average level was 1.6 children per couple. And as compared with the figure in Japan, in Europe, and in the US, this is much lower. Even in these industrialized nations, their fertility is well below replacement, well below 2 child per couple. But their fertility intention has been staying above 2 for many decades at a very stable level, above 2 children per couple. But we have the intention much lower than 2 kids per couple. And also we found that the desire to have kids is even lower for younger cohorts. The average intention for those who were born after 1985, okay, so they are younger, they have lower intentions than those who were born before 1985. Then how the intention differs by educational groups. And interesting, the findings are quite interesting. We found that the highest educational groups, those with a college education, they have the highest intentions, about 1.7 children per couple, while the second highest were found among the group with the lowest education, those who only complete the compulsory education. And the lowest intention was found among the group with the senior who complete the senior high school education. So there is no like linear correlations between education and your intention. It does not necessarily mean that you have higher education, you will have like high intention, or you have lower education, then you will have intention. There is not linear relationships. So this intention measures the ideal number of children you prefer to have, and then what is the ideal gender structure of your children. Here we found that for those who view that one child is the best status, about 60% of them prefer to have a boy, and 40% prefer to have a girl. And among those who prefer to have 2 kids, then the overwhelming majority, 95%, prefer to have 1 boy and 1 girl. So a balanced gender structure, 1 boy and 1 girl, is not only the American dream, but also most preferred by Chinese young people, also the Chinese dream. But if they are only allowed to have like 1 child, then still for some of them, having a son is quite crucial. And then here, desire, previously we said that measures preference. So when we are talking about desire, we don't take into account of any like real concerns. So we don't take into account of your education, your career, your income status, just measures your preference, what is the ideal status. But when you are making like specific fertility plans, you have to take into account of all of these like realistic concerns. So here we can see whether the desire matches your plan. We found that among the young people who view that no child is the best and one child is the best, their plan is quite consistent with their preference. So the plan measures actually reflects their fertility desire to a large extent. But here we can see that among those who view that 2 children are the best, only three quarters of them do plan to have 2 kids, while the remaining 25%, actually they only plan to have 1, even if they are allowed to. So many like real issues like economic pressures and also your time constraints will force these young couples to give up the extra child, even if they prefer to have 2. And after the child is born, the next issue is who will raise your child. In Shanghai, we still have very limited access to public child care centers, which could accommodate the very young kids under 2 children. So in that case, we found that about 1/3 of the post-80s in Shanghai, they rely on their own parents to take care of the very young kids. Okay? And this proportion is higher among the well-educated groups. For those with a college education, about 50% of them, they rely on their grandparents to take care of the grandchildren. So on the one hand, the opportunity cost of child rearing for these like well-educated groups are higher because they have like better paid jobs. And on the other hand, like if the parents are more utilitarian but not altruistic, then they are more willing to invest in children with better education and better careers, so that they could expect for like higher returns when they get old. So here we can see that in Shanghai, the older parents in their 50s, 60s, or even in 70s, they are not only a burden, they are not a burden for their children. Actually, they are very valuable like resources for their children. They serve as a very strong domestic helpers once they have the kids. Okay, so looking forward, so what will be the future direction of fertility changes in Shanghai? The survey was done in 2013, while on March the 1st, 2014, Shanghai welcomed a new policy, new family planning policy, allowing the couples, either of whom is coming from the single child families, to have a second child, while previously only the couples, both of whom are coming from the single child families, could have a second child. But this new policy, this relaxation, does not welcome like a very warm response from the public. Only a small proportion of the qualified couples. Actually, for the whole population, for the whole country, the proportion is less than 10%, really applied for the second child. So when we look at like Shanghai's case, when we look at the very low fertility intentions among the young population, then it's likely that Shanghai will be sustaining its very low fertility for a longer time, even we relax our one-child policy. Thank you very much.